Hello dear students. In the last class, we have talked about the need of cultural studies, and in that we have discussed different needs why cultural studies get existed. And now we will begin with our prescribed essay, the text, that is the idea of cultural studies. And in that text also we can find out how this cultural study get emerged as a separate theory, as a separate discipline to study the impact of culture on different elements. So let's begin with this essay. There are many ideas about what constitutes the center of cultural studies. The center of cultural studies, as we have talked in the last class, that it has been emerged or founded in 1964 at Birmingham. So how this cultural studies or this center get emerged, there are so many ideas behind that, why it emerged, and before that what happened in this particularly. So many arguments are there about the shape of the field and the appropriateness of specific practices within it that are driven by the original disciplinary orientation of individual contributors. Cultural studies or cultural study, it is not just originated with the Center of Cultural Studies that has been established in 1964, but there are different arguments about the origin of this study, the need of this study, and different ideas behind that that has been emerged even before that center also. It means this cultural studies was somewhere before 1964 also, and that is because of the contributions of different theorists. Means individual theorists, they have contributed towards the cultural studies, and because of them there are different paths and specific practices are there, the appropriateness of this cultural studies, why it should be used as a separate discipline, and a lot different things are there that has been emerged before the emergence or inauguration of this Center of Cultural Studies. And because of that, miss, see, there is a complexity into it. There was the criticism why cultural studies itself, and if we find, then historians tend to be suspicious of the textual analysis practiced by those who originally trained as literary critics. Now there are literary critics, historians, sociologists, ethnographers, so different uh, personalities are there, different theorists are there, and they devote themselves towards that particular discipline. And this devotion to their particular discipline, because of that the historians particularly, they are suspicious about the literary critics, as they are they are completely devoted to literary text. Then what about art, about, because culture is something, it is related, not only literature, but it would be evident in society, in sociology also we can find it would be evident in uh, what we can say art. Okay, so in different parts the culture is an culture plays important role, and that's why these different theorists, philosophers, they question on someone else study, just like historians question the study of literary critics. The literary critics in turn are often suspicious of the way in which sociologists or ethnographers accept statements from their subjects about the cultural studies, and that is without sufficient analysis and interpretation. Because a sociologist, he will study it in society, a literary critic, he will study it from literary text, then art critics, they will study the role and impact of culture in particular art. Historian, they will study the impact of culture on historical events, elements. So all of these, they are different, and that's why this becomes a complex term. Now this term particularly, it would be a mistake to see cultural studies as a new discipline or even as a separate group of disciplines. Okay, as in 1964, the Center for Cultural Studies get established, but we cannot call it as a new discipline or as a separate discipline, okay, which is detached from all other discipline of the study. But as culture itself is part of so many different things, in the same way, this cultural studies is a multidisciplinary ideology. It is a multidisciplinary study, and that's why the cultural studies is an interdisciplinary field where certain concerns and methods have come together, and the usefulness of this togetherness is that it has enabled us to understand relationships that were not accessible through the existing disciplines. Means this is not the contribution of the single discipline. Okay, it is not only the contribution of literary critics, but sociologists are there, ethnographs are there, historians are there. So different theories, different ideas from different disciplines that has been combined together. Okay, different methods and concerns, they come together, and this togetherness, it enabled us to understand the relationships of different things, and with the help of that uh, we will get access through of the cultural studies and this analysis, different methods of different historians, critics, and ethnographs, sociologists, like that. If we see customarily the cultural studies, as we have talked, it is seen to begin with the publication of Richard Hogarth's The Uses of Literacy, that has been published in 1958, and Raymond Williams' Culture and Society in 1966. That was first published in 1958, and The Long Revolution, that is in 1961, first published. So these are some of the important works. Actually, these works, first of all, they have been published before 1964, means before the establishment of the Center for Cultural Studies, and it is supposed or it is seen that cultural studies has began with that. But actually, this cultural studies, okay, individual thinker, philosopher, critics, they have started in different references before that itself, and both can be noted for their concentration. Now, just what we can say, evidently, or this theory, it has started with Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams. With proof, we can say that this has been started with them, though it has started earlier itself. And both these critics, okay, they are noted for their concentration on the forms of literary texts and on their moral social significance. Means what they did before that also, some critics, philosophers, they get existed and they have talked about culture, but these two critics, they are particularly noted for their concentration on the forms of literary text. Means they themselves have developed some of the methods to analyze the works, and this analysis become significant one, and that's why we remember them most importantly as a cultural critic. So both of them, they generate their methods of textual criticism so as to read cultural forms other than literature. Okay, this culture or cultural studies, it is not only related with literature. So there are different other forms also, such as popular song, the mass media, okay, movies, a lot different art. So different forms are there, and these two people, that is Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams, they generate their methods of textual criticism to read cultural forms. To read cultural forms is how culture is represented in different forms other than literature, that is popular song, videos, and movies, everywhere we can find out them, and that's why they become most important critics of cultural studies. But both writers suffered from the lack of a method that could more appropriately analyze the ways in which such cultural forms and practices produced their social meanings and pleasures. Now, both of them, they tried their best, and as everything which begins at first, okay, uh, miss when we start a work at first, then definitely our speed would be so slow, we would neglect something in it, but when we practice it, more and more practice would be taken place in the particular study, then automatically it get furnished and perfect one. So being beginner of this, they lack some method that could appropriately analyze the ways in which such cultural forms and practices produced, means different cultural forms and practices in media, as I told you, in art, in literature, everywhere in different way, and how they should be connected, how they should be given social meanings, and the pleasures from that what we get. So they failed to develop such a method, and they failed to reconnect the text with society. Okay, they analyzed text, and they said that the text has such a type of cultural ideas into it, but how that idea should be connected with society, in that method they cannot they could not generate, and with the culture and individuals that produced and consumed them, because culture is produced by the people, person, and community, and also an individual, and that is consumed by them itself. The culture is consumed, the culture is used by person, individuals, and community and group, all of this. So these people, they produced it and they consumed it, but these two critics, they failed to connect them, the text, okay, it's a literary text, and society. So they failed to connect these two ideas with their explanation and methods that they have generated. One was required to think about how culture was structured as a whole before one could examine its processes. Now, when we have to study culture and cultural studies, so first of all, we have to understand how this culture was structured as a whole. Means what the culture is, that we have talked in the introductory part itself, and after that we have talked about the need of cultural studies. So basically, how this culture gets structured as a whole means it is in general and in particular, this culture or cultural studies, how it get emerged, and that we have talked about this as the development of human beings, okay, the evolution of human being, from that itself culture get started. So we have to examine, we have to first study that, and then we have to go for the analysis of the culture in different text and art. As Anne Chambers has suggested us, explanations based on the idea of totality, on the rational frame that connects the most distant and complex parts, are characteristics of the great continental schools of thought, and that are Marxism, classical sociology, psychoanalysis, structuralism, semiotics. Okay, Ian Chambers is a critic, and what he says the explanations based on the idea of totality. Totality means all should be involved into it, complete. You might have studied this in structuralism somewhere. So the ideas that are based on the totality and on the rational frame that connects the most distant and complex parts. Now, culture is something, okay, it is not of a single person or of an individual, but this is a complex term. Culture means something. Culture, it is the culture of region, it is the culture of a particular community. So these different complex ideas would be combined together, and then the culture get formed. And These are the characteristics of great continental school of thought. And this culture or cultural studies, behind that there are so many different school of thoughts, okay, particularly different theories, what we call it as Marxism, classical sociology, psychoanalysis, structuralism, semiotics. These different school of thoughts, they worked for the development of cultural studies in their particular field, in their particular discipline. They tried to analyze and justify culture, and this also established the background or base for the development of cultural studies. The European influence on British cultural studies largely came from structuralism. Now, how this cultural studies before 1964 we are talking is what elements, other elements get influenced on it. And basically, as we know, cultural studies, it has emerged in London. Okay, this 1964 Center for Cultural Studies, it was founded in London itself, and this has a strong influence of structuralism on it. Okay, so this structuralism has many variants, but its common characteristic is an interest in the systems, the sets of relationships, the formal structures that frame and enable the production of meaning. Now, structuralism, you might have studied before. Structuralism, what it do, particularly it focuses on the systems. Okay, it's different systems in different structures. Any individual, anything what we take in a particular structure, they have the particular role, and when the structure get changes, automatically the role of that individual will also get changed, and that we have to study with Saussure and all these things, the great linguist. So the base of this cultural studies is there in the structuralism, particularly thinking about European study, so European influence. And this structuralism influenced cultural studies, or before the establishment of this 1964 center, structuralism has a greater influence on culture, because in structuralism particularly they have focused different structures, and culture also have different structures, because when we change a geographical area, the culture get changed. Okay, when we think about a different community, their culture will get changed. Means in a particular structure, a particular culture has meaning, and if we change that structure, the same culture may get different meaning. Okay, for example, in our way, or in normal Maharashtrian culture, okay, to greet someone, we use the pair of hands, but the same thing may not be used in different geographical location. They would use some different gestures to welcome the guest and all these things. Means in a particular structure, culture has a particular meaning. When the structure get changes, the meaning of that particular form would also get changed. And in the same sense, in the same way, it is about the language also, because language is also get constructed. Language is also the part of culture, and how language get emerged, in the same way culture also might have emerged, and we will study it with in the next part, that is with Saussure. Okay, so in the next part we will talk about Ferdinand de Saussure, his ideas about language and also culture.